Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Orion Taraban, and this is PsycHacks, Better Living Through Psychology. And today we're going to be doing something a little different, as you can tell. This won't be a short talk. This will be a longer talk, and it will be a talk with somebody. It will be a discussion, I'm very happy to say. Hopefully the first of many. And today I will be talking with my friend and colleague, Dr. Shawn Smith. Shawn is a psychologist who works in private practice in the state of Colorado. He also specializes in men's mental health, and he is the author of several books, which I hope we can get to later. I've known Shawn personally for a couple of years, and I really respect his perspective, and I'm very excited to have you on the show today, Shawn. So thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be the first interview or discussion you've had on your channel. And I think it sends a good positive message to the world, because by having me on first, you're telling the world that you will literally talk to anybody. So that's a good message to put out there.
It's really not true, because the viewers might find this interesting. It's like I actually was a fan of Shawn many years ago, and I came upon his book and I reached out to him and found some of his stuff on YouTube. And I reached out to him cold many years ago, and he had the kindness to respond, and we had initiated a collegial relationship since then. So I was kind of starstruck by Shawn when I first encountered his stuff, and it's really great that we've been able to develop this relationship over the years.
Yeah. So what do you want to chat about today, Orion?
Well, I want to chat about women, and I want to chat about relationships. And I know those are two of your favorite subjects, and there are two that get a lot of airtime on my channel as well. So I thought I would start by pitching you a softball question that I already know the answer to, and then we'll get into kind of maybe deeper waters. But I think it's an interesting question. So how is dating like the FBI?
That's you pulled that out of my book, the Tactical Guide to Women, I think.
I think
And
so.
in the Tactical Guide to Women, which for if people don't know about it, it's a book about relationships for men. Basically, it's about how to vet women that you're bringing into your life. And one of the things I came across when I was writing that book is the fact that the FBI, at least on their website at the time, went through the steps that they use to vet agents. And it's a very long process. It takes a couple of years. And it happened to be what I think about in terms of vetting a potential partner. If you're looking for a long-term partner that you want to build a shared enterprise with, you need to invest that time to get to know what they're really about. And that's what the FBI does. They spend a lot of time watching people, and that's part of vetting potential partners too.
I mean, it makes sense to me. And this is just a couple of years for a career. If you're vetting for a potential long-term partner, that's for life. That's an even bigger commitment, in my opinion, than just something that you're going to be doing for money,
Indeed. Yeah.
as important as that is. I often say on my channel that men should exercise emotional discipline for the first 6 months minimum, and I get a lot of pushback on 6 months. And here you are saying that it can take years to adequately and appropriately vet a potential partner.
Well, here's the way I think about it. You know, we go through, if you're in a relationship, a new romantic relationship, you go through this infatuation phase. And during this infatuation phase, puppy love, the honeymoon phase, whatever we want to call it, men and women both go through a period where their brain chemistry literally deviates from baseline. And there was a study a few years ago where they looked at serotonin signatures in cerebrospinal fluid, I believe. And they actually noticed that when people are infatuated, we're just seeing the world differently. We're not seeing ourselves the same. We're not seeing the other person the same. Not only are we not seeing them correctly or ourselves correctly, correctly being the way we normally see things, but we're also trying to present our best selves. So there's a lot of beer goggles going on while we're infatuated with somebody. And that period, according to the research, can last anywhere between 6 and 18 months. Some people say it lasts longer. Some people say it doesn't. But my thought is that you don't really see the other person clearly, and you're not allowing them to see you clearly while you're in that infatuated stage, while your brain chemistry is out of whack. And so you don't really start getting to know somebody on a meaningful level until that period ends. And that's when you can really start assessing the relationship, because that's when the real person shows up. And one of the ways to know that that's ending is the person becomes more three-dimensional to you. So you're not idealizing them and you're not being idealized so much. Like all the little things that used to be cute and charming, maybe they start to get a little bit irritating now. So that there's two sides to the coin. When you've come out of that infatuation phase, you start to see things more accurately. So we're talking years, really. If you want to spend a year getting to know somebody after the infatuation ends, that's a big chunk of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to be more accurate, what it sounds like you're saying is not simply that you're not seeing the other person clearly during that time, because that could go pretty much on either side of the fence. It's that you're seeing the other person as better than they are.
Right.
It doesn't seem
Yeah,
like
you're
in that
motivated.
infatuation period, people suffer from this person that I'm dating and sleeping with is worse than they actually are.
Right.
The bias is
Yes.
always on one side.
Yeah.
Okay. I talk about this in my channel. I call it the crisis of disillusionment. And I think that most of that limerence and that feeling is really just projected fantasy. We know next to nothing about somebody except that we're attracted to them in the very initial stages of courtship. And I think the mind abhors a vacuum, and it tries to fill in the gaps in our knowledge base with exactly what we would want to find there so that we can be more in alignment with our attraction. And what generally happens, when people talk about getting over their exes and they're coming to terms with like the red flags that they saw but kind of ignored early on in the dating process. It's like most of these relationships that tend not to work out, there were, I think, a lot of signs for most people earlier on in the relationship, but people just chose not to look at them. But I think that if enough accumulate over time or something really jarring happens, then the projected fantasy shatters. And that's the crisis of disillusionment. And then you get to see the person in front of you, kind of warts and all. And it's only then that you actually get to decide if you want to have a relationship with that person, because you actually weren't even seeing who that person was up until that point. And that's an interesting fork in the road for a lot of folks.
Yeah, there's this term, confabulation, that clinicians use to describe somebody when they are recalling something that didn't happen. And it's not that they're lying. So that this would happen, for example, after a brain injury where the parts of the brain are not functioning well, or certain types of dementia or alcohol dementia, that sort of thing, where the brain is physically damaged. And when a person is trying to remember something that happened, to remember a sequence of events or some piece of history, they will fill in the blanks with something that's plausible. They don't know that they're doing it, and it's not intentional. They're not lying. But this term confabulation gets attached to organic disorders and injuries of the brain, when really we're all doing it all the time. We're filling in blanks, just like you said. And so when you're in that infatuation stage, there's a lot of question marks, and you're filling it in with what seems plausible and also what is positively valenced.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk about attraction then, because it sounds like people have a choice at that moment of whether or not there's enough there to continue to pursue a relationship with the person after the crisis of disillusionment or after the limerence period wears off. Is attraction a choice?
That's an interesting question. I'll give you my thought, and I want to hear your thought. The emotional side of the mind takes a split second to decide that it's attracted to somebody. And it's the visual appeal, it's the scent, it's the words, it's the whole package, the whole presentation. And this is one of the problematic things about Tinder, is that so much of that gets factored out and you're only seeing an image. But the emotional side of the mind takes almost no time to know that it's attracted to somebody. The rational side takes a lot longer to assess the situation. And so I think that part of what people are dealing with in the dating realm is that is that it takes so little time to decide that you're attracted to somebody, and it takes so much time to decide if that attraction is warranted. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, is attraction a choice? I think there's an involuntary component to it, but I also think that you can choose to some degree. But I'm going to stop there. I'll come back to my other thought in a minute. What do you think so far?
I think you're saying that attraction is not a choice, in the fact that the emotional mind can decide within a split second whether or not there's attraction. It makes me wonder whether you can be rationally attracted to somebody. That does not sound hot. That does not sound sexy to me. I think
No.
you can rationally decide whether this person might be a good partner for you, or a good husband or wife or mother or father. But rational attraction, I think, sounds like a paradox to me, or an oxymoron. But I want to bring this up because it's something that I see with the guys I work with clinically, and maybe you see this too. Sometimes, for whatever reason, men's attraction can be pretty predictably biased towards women who, for whatever reason, are just their kryptonite.
Yes.
And when men become more aware of their patterns of attraction, it can feel like they're stuck between a really bad choice, where they can follow their attraction, which leads them to a dumpster fire relationship, as it has, dozens of times in the past, or they can move forward with a woman who rationally sounds like she might be a good partner, but leaves him feeling completely, I don't know, bored or uninterested. And that seems like a really tough decision for guys. So if attraction is not a choice, are those guys doomed?
Well, I'll give you one framework to think about it, but I want to riff off something you said. Rationally attracted. Can you be rationally attracted to somebody? Seems implausible. Imagine trying to be rationally horny for somebody. That's not going to work.
No,
So
it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. But I think the way guys approach relationships is so often from a standpoint of desperation, or if it's not desperation, it's at least I have to take what I can get, which is maybe desperation light, because that's maybe been their experience. However, they arrived at this point where they'll look out on the landscape and they'll look at all of the possibilities, and they'll zero in on the hottest one. And like you said, so often the hottest one to them is their relationship kryptonite, rather than a different way to approach it. And this is where cultural structures like religions come in handy, where if you change the paradigm a bit, where you're not looking out on the entire landscape and choosing who's most attractive, and this applies equally to women too, that you are clear on your own values and you're clear on what you're building in life. And so you look at a smaller subset, you look at the prospects that actually align with what you're trying to accomplish in life, which is a much smaller group. It's not the entire landscape, it's a small group. And then you choose the hottest one there. And this is some place where, like I said, if you're part of a structured religion, this seems to be easier for people that have that structural framework, because everyone around them, or at least the prospects around them, they basically share the same structural framework, the same similar values and that sort of thing. So they're somebody who is part of a religious community, and I'm not pushing religion, I'm just using this as an example, that somebody who has that structural framework, they've already, in a sense, if they buy into that structural framework, they factored out everybody else. And so they're only looking at this small group of people who would be a good fit for their life. And then they're choosing the most attractive among that smaller pool.
Yeah, well, what about the rest of us who don't have a tight-knit religious community to rely on? Because I think that's a diminishing number of, especially young people in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably the majority of people that don't have that tight of a framework.
Mm-hmm. So it
and so
might be more difficult to find the set of people who already seem to more or less conform with your values and direction in life, and then choose among them, right?
Yeah. And that's where I think, that's 100% correct. And it sounds like it's a case for you. Certainly was a case for me. It's the case for most people. But if you have a sense of exactly what you're trying to accomplish in life, if your values are buttoned down, and you have a sense of the purpose that you're moving toward in life, and you have a sense of what it is that you the reason that you even want a relationship, then the people that will fit within that become more apparent to you. And it becomes more apparent who the people who won't fit within your values, your purpose, your goals in life.
Okay, well, that sounds like frame. That sounds like a
Yeah.
guy knows what he's about. He knows what his mission or purpose in life is like. He's potentially extrapolated to some degree a lifestyle for himself. He knows what works. He knows what doesn't work for him. He knows what he wants. He knows what he doesn't want. And then he's trying to find a fit, which on some level suggests that he's inviting the woman into his frame, into his life, into his lifestyle. And I think that's a really good way for men to approach dating. I think especially younger guys in their 20s, you talked about the desperation. I think it could even be this sense of women almost like as a savior, like that a good woman will like lift him out of his loneliness or despair or be his muse or give him purpose. Have you seen this, Shawn?
Yeah. One of my friends on Twitter actually posted this yesterday. He posted about being at a cafe or a diner or something, and he was sitting next to a man who was in his 60s, and the man in his 60s was explaining to the waitress that his depression had finally lifted because he finally found a girlfriend who would date him.
Mm.
And my friend's point was some guys never learn. And the lesson that I think my friend thought this guy should have learned was that women are not the key to curing your depression. That's got to come from you, which I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think I think this is part and parcel to idealizing or romanticizing women or relationships, that it's my missing piece, or it will give me the reason to get out of bed in the morning. It will complete me. It will give me a sense of self. I'll feel like I'm a person of value because this woman who I've invested with a patina of even godliness, who knows, saintliness or virtue, has deigned to look upon me. And in the context of that, I now feel like a man. I now feel like I can conquer the world. And I think what you're
Yeah.
telling me is
And
that it makes more sense for guys to kind of like become men on their own terms and then invite women into their lives further down the road. Is that an
yeah, you and I have
oversimplification?
a mutual friend colleague who talks about external sources of validation. Ken Curry is who I'm talking about. And he talks about external sources of validation. And it's a path to destruction. You can't have your source of validation depending on the moods of somebody else, or their approval for today. It's got to be that you're on your path, and someone else can join in. They can walk next to you if they want, but they are not the source of your sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you outsource it to them, they can revoke it at a moment's notice. This poor guy at the diner, the 60-year-old guy, girl's going to break up with him, and he's going to be right back where he was, feeling depressed.
Well, does that suggest that men should maybe wait longer to begin dating or potentially to get into long-term relationships? Because I think it kind of takes longer for men to get their feet under them. Women have just shorter timelines. They mature faster biologically. They seem to mature faster emotionally, and they do have their reproductive window. So they're kind of they grow up a little bit faster than a lot of guys. And if it would be good for the man to know what his purpose is and to have his lifestyle extrapolated, it would make it easier to attract a woman who would have goodness of fit with that purpose. What do you think about the movement that guys sort of like spend their 20s grinding or getting their shit together before they really
Maybe
even
there's
begin to examine women?
Yeah, or serious relationships. But maybe there's something to the fact that, I don't know the exact numbers, but it seems to be across societies that men in long-term relationships, men tend to be a little older than women, something like 5 years older on average. Maybe that's too high. Maybe it's a little lower than that, but maybe there's something to the fact that Men do take a little bit longer to get their feet under them. The expectations are different for men. You are expected to go into society and produce more than you consume if you're going to carry a man card, meaning you need to be in a position where you can provide if you're going to be respected. You need to be in a position where you're contributing something to society. And women have their expectations too, but it's not that. It's a little bit different. And it takes a while to establish that. And so maybe that's why we see an age difference in long-term commitments.
Let's talk about this, because that's certainly the cultural expectation for men, or let's say masculinity, is to be the provider protector. And one of the one of the promises of feminism was that it would be good for men, because just like women might have been restricted to caregiver, nurturer roles historically, which might have been restrictive or repressive, that men have also been relegated to these restrictive and potentially repressive social roles of provider protector. And the promise of feminism is that both men and women can experiment with non-traditional gender roles. And what do you think about that? Like, would that behoove a man to examine?
Which part of that?
The promise of feminism, as I understand it, is that it could be good for men too, because men, like women, have been restricted and or repressed by their traditional gender roles, in this case being a provider protector, and on the other hand being, let's say, a caregiver nurturer. And I would say that in the last, several decades, women have really run with this sort of gender role liberation, and they're doing very well socially. Like, as you know, they're graduating high school, college, postgraduate at a significantly higher rate than men. I think for the first time in history, women under 30 are out earning men under 30. They seem to be thriving in a lot of traditional metrics of success, whereas I'm not really seeing that when men deviate from those traditional gender roles that they flourish. Does that make sense?
I'm not seeing that either. And it's very easy for feminists to say that a man should surrender that traditional masculinity and that he should be more emotional, and whatever they're saying at the American Psychological Association about the man box. The man box is this idea that men are conditioned to be stoic and squash down their emotions and just be these hard-headed knuckleheads. It's very easy, number one, to straw man that and say that there's this man box, and to oversimplify what masculinity means as you're actually living your life. And it's very easy for a feminist to say it would benefit men to give that up. And I'm not just talking about female feminists. I'm talking about male feminists who burrow into a nice, comfy, bureaucratic position at a gender studies department or at the American Psychological Association. These guys are just contemptible to me, because what they're saying is it's okay for you, Orion, to go out and cry in public. And it is okay for you to go out and cry in public, but they're not going to pay the price for you going out and crying in public. They're not going to pay the price for you surrendering your masculine desire to go out and create something, to use a little bit of that aggressiveness that they're always whining and complaining about, to build something in the world. If you don't do that, you're the one who pays the price. You pay the price in lost employment opportunities. You pay the price in lost mating opportunities. You pay the price in loss of prestige. But the feminist sitting over there writing the paper is saying, well, it's to your benefit to do this. I disagree.
Let me play devil's advocate here, because I can imagine that when women first started entering into traditional male roles in society, that they got a lot of pushback, and it wasn't very easy for them. And maybe I think they absolutely experienced discrimination and all kinds of pressure to return to their traditional gender roles. So I believe that if a man publicly and visibly deviates from his masculine role, he suffers social consequences. But my devil's advocate position is, well, maybe that just means that we need more awareness and understanding, just like maybe the men needed about women entering into the marketplace.
It's possible, but I think I'm skeptical of the devil's advocate position, because what we're really talking about is evolved adaptations for mating that are 200,000 years old. And we know what women, well, we have very strong evidence of what women look for in men. And evolutionary psychology does a pretty good job of explaining this, that women are looking for two things. They are looking for the ability to do something in the world, the ability to provide, and the willingness to stick around and actually invest in children. That's what women look for. That's 200,000 years old. And I think that's a different variable than women going into the workplace, because if an attractive woman goes into the workplace, she's still an attractive woman. It's not like men are not going to mate with her or choose her just because she's standing next to them at work. And if anything, she's going to be fending them off even more. What we see when men relinquish the masculine mandate to go out and create something is that their opportunities diminish tremendously.
Okay, well then I understand that. I agree with that. You seem to have a particular bone to pick with male feminists, and I find that phenomenon to be interesting, because it does sound from this conversation so far, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that it doesn't seem like feminism really advances the goals of men. Like it doesn't seem to make them happier. It doesn't seem to get them better dating or mating options. Why would a man become a feminist?
I think it's a great mating strategy, because if you are that guy who can, it's like a dishonest signal in the animal kingdom, where you have honest signals of strength. Like a peacock's tail is an honest signal of virility, because it takes resources to generate that tail. You can't fake it. But there are dishonest signals, and dishonest signals are lies. Essentially, they're the illusion of vigor and vitality without it really being there. And I think that for a male feminist, and I know some guys are going to hate me for this, and I have to say right out of the gate, I don't care. For a man to adopt a feminist mindset, and we should probably define feminism at some point, because we're talking about it as if we're working with a common definition. So let's define it in a minute. But for a man to take on a feminist mindset that is essentially anti-male, he's being sneaky. He's saying, look at me, ladies, I'm on your side. That guy over there, the guy that's working on the crane over there and actually building that building across the street, he's not on your side. He's a brute. He probably voted for Trump. You don't want anything to do with that guy. I'm your guy. I'm writing these papers about how we all need to take better care of you. That's kind of a sneaky, dishonest signal.
Do you think these men are conscious that this might be a mating strategy?
I think some probably are to some degree. And I will give many of them the benefit of the doubt. Many men marinate, or they're marinating in this ideology from day one, and maybe they just can't see past it, because they're getting it from kindergarten all the way through college. If they go to college, they're getting in their entertainment, they're getting it from Marvel comics, they're getting all the female empowerment stuff, which is fine. It's not about being anti-female. So maybe they just can't see past that. They've been told for decades that you're a good guy if you think this way, you're a bad guy if you think that way.
That's really interesting. What's coming to mind is this classic season of Survivor, the TV show. I'm not a big fan of Survivor, but I think it's a fascinating game because it's almost impossible to win. And in this classic season, it was men versus women. And the way it generally works in the beginning is that there's all sorts of like physical challenges. And based on which side wins, the other side gets weakened. And I think through the first maybe month of the season, it was absolute massacre. I don't think the women had won a single challenge versus the men, and they were dwindling. And yet, the winners of that season were all women. Like the top 3 finishers were women. And I was like,
Why is that?
How did this happen? Because the women could not outcompete the men at a single event. The way it happened is that the women drove a wedge between the men. The women began uh, they went to some of the lower status, the lower performing men in the other camp and said, look, you guys are going to beat us. But as soon as we're gone, who do you think is next? Do you think you're going to beat these alphas? So you might think you're winning right now and you feel really good, but there's no way that you're going to beat Mr. Chad over there. And so basically the women succeeded in negotiating a block with the lower status men at a strategic juncture of the season. And that block succeeded in voting out the highest status alpha men who were the most threatening to both the women and the lower status men. And then as soon as they were gone, all of the lower status men were the next ones to follow because the women just voted them out. So
that's fascinating.
Isn't that incredible? I mean, and the differences between the two camps were so striking. The men's camp was running like clockwork. They had fire, they had shelter, they were well fed. The women were shivering and wet and hungry. They didn't have the survivor skills to like. They were barely hanging on at some point. They resorted to a desperate strategy, but it worked. And I think one of the so they used fear to motivate the lower status men against the higher status men. But I think they also used the prospect of, I think they seduced them a little bit too.
Uh-huh.
But,
so what the women lacked in physical capability to master the environment, the men lacked in psychological ability to recognize when they were being plotted on and manipulated.
Yeah, those lower status men were definitely, I mean, it was very fascinating because one of the strategies was to play the damsel in distress, and the women would come over to the men's camp and say, oh, we're so cold, you guys are so strong and you know all about fire, like couldn't you help us, couldn't you just spare the fire, it costs you nothing, it's like really kind of, and they're their competitors in this season of Survivor. It's men versus women. So can you imagine a rival pulling that card in like a sporting match or something like that, in a boxing match?
Right.
It'd be kind of ridiculous. But yes, women are generally much more adept at, let's say, emotional and psychological warfare than men. I made an episode about this, that if we had a no holds barred bar brawl between a man and a woman, it would be no contest. I mean, the vast majority of men would just mop the floor with women, which is why we don't do that. It just seems like it's too unfair of a fight. And to be fair, that's generally not how fighting occurs in most relationships. And the vast majority of relationships, it's not a physical fight, it's an emotional or a verbal argument. And the vast majority of men are completely outmatched, completely outclassed by women. They don't know how to argue like women do. They don't know how to use words to hurt in the same way that women do. And that leaves them at a significant disadvantage. So I think that it's really important for men to kind of, I mean, there's this trend in society to like not be a harmless man. Like you need to have strength, you need to have skills, and a competent, strong man is not a harmless man. He could cause harm. He also has the power to do good. It's really the same power. You know what I'm saying? You have to have power one way or the other. And I think it behooves a lot of men to learn some of the tricks of the trade when it comes to women, so that they kind of know how to hold themselves in a fight. Just like I think it makes sense for guys to know how to like take a punch or throw a punch. It makes sense for guys to know how to recognize emotional manipulation and how to potentially tolerate and resolve their own discomfort that comes up in the presence of a woman's distress.
Yeah, you said so much good stuff there, particularly that last point. Maybe we can come back to tolerating distress, but this stuff starts in childhood, where you can see boys and girls on the playground, and there've been studies about this, where boys are competitive, obviously, and there's a lot of cooperation when boys are playing, but there's these little moments where the competitiveness gets aggressive, and what you'll see is physical attack, physical conflict. With girls, they're just as competitive, but what you tend to see with little girls is reputation destruction and that kind of psychological warfare. And so they start practicing their trade very young. And some, just like some boys become very good fighters, or very skilled fighters, I should say, some women become very skilled at psychological warfare. And I think it's important to say that most men, most boys and men, and most girls and women are not interested in that level of conflict. They just kind of want to get along and live their life and enjoy things. But yeah, and I was also going to add that, you know, I've worked with couples for a lot of years, and I've heard guys use precisely the two words that you just used. They felt outclassed and outmatched when they were having an argument. They just felt completely outmaneuvered verbally when they were having an argument. So they're very much at a disadvantage because they're not going to get physically violent. You know, most of the, every guy I've worked with, they're not willing to get physically violent. And so women have this tremendous psychological advantage sometimes. And I agree with you completely that it really benefits us to learn how to use words.
I also think it's useful to approach relationships from a universal disarmament perspective. So it's like, as a man, if we both recognize that my physical strength is superior to you, and therefore it wouldn't necessarily be fair to flex on you in that way, so I'm gonna disarm myself in this way, then maybe let's recognize that you, the woman, might have more opportunity or power or skill in inflicting emotional harm on me. So I can't give up my gun if you keep yours, kind of a thing. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, mhm. Interesting. Yeah, you talked about competitiveness and you also alluded to the APA. So let's just make that explicit. So can you share with us where that reference is coming from?
Yeah, that most people probably have at least heard of it, that the APA in 2019 came out with these guidelines for working with boys and men. And there were some good things in the guidelines. And clinical guidelines are a set of ideal practices for clinicians. And so the APA will come out with guidelines, clinical guidelines for work with depression and pancreatic cancer, and, you know, just all kinds of clinical guidelines. And every once in a while they get very political with their guidelines. It's not the usual, but the APA guidelines for working with boys and men, and then some guidelines that came out the following year for working with girls and women, very political. They were feminist dogma from the ground up. And so let me give you my sense of the definition of feminism. There's the feminist next door who believes that feminism is about equal opportunities and equal responsibilities and equal protection of the law and all of that. So by that definition, I could be called a feminist because I believe in those things. But that's not the dogmatic ideological feminism that is taught, for example, in gender studies department. It's not the feminism that informed the APA guidelines. This comes out of the postmodernist agenda to pit groups against each other, and, you know, everything is a power struggle, and everything has to be seen through the lens of power dynamics and victims and oppressors and so forth. That's the feminism that I'm talking about. Ideological, angry. It's not about equality. It's about advancing women beyond men, because men have been the oppressors supposedly for all these centuries, and now it's time for some retribution and some kicking ass.
Yeah, I would say that it's not relegated to gender studies departments. I've worked with a
No.
number of young guys in college, and I think at least a few of them have even dropped out. And what I often hear is, if they're in any kind of humanities-based program, generally
Yeah.
hasn't infiltrated the hard sciences, but if it's English or literature, sociology, psychology, um, I've heard guys say that if they didn't adequately self-flagellate, they were like socially ostracized, and that the classmates and the teachers were openly hostile to and dismissive of their perspectives simply because they're male or a white male or a white straight male, the intersectionalism.
Mhm.
Very strange.
It
I mean,
is.
it
And this
seems
is where
like
I have
that
to
sort of attitude
walk
is
back.
just explicitly sexist and racist.
It is. And this is where I have to walk back my previous aggravation with male feminists, because if that's what you've been hearing your entire life throughout your education, that if you're not sufficiently self-flagellating, you're a bad guy, that's kind of, you know, it's kind of hard not to buy into that after years and decades of it.
But here, okay, so yeah, let's finish this conversation because we were talking about the sexual strategy of male feminists, and I talked about the survivor. We could see potentially parallels between the lower status men and male feminists, because maybe the male feminists also see that they couldn't otherwise successfully compete on an open, even playing field with the higher status men. And so they might be pulled to throw those men under the bus in the hopes that once they're kind of out of the picture or eliminated from the dating market, that the women will mate and date with them. But in the Survivor episode, it sure didn't work out that way. Maybe they were even led to believe that that was going to happen by the women, but they were the first ones to go. Like the women
Mm-hmm.
completely turned their backs on them as soon as they successfully got rid of the high status men who were the real threat to both groups. So I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if the male feminist sexual strategy is all that successful. Like, are male feminists swimming in optionality? That's not
Yeah,
that's
I don't
not
know.
that's not the impression that I get. And so it just sort of makes me wonder that if that is a strategy, even if it's been taught to you from a very young age, at what point do you say, hey, this isn't working? This isn't getting
Right.
me
And at
the
what
optionality I want. It's not making me happier. It's not advancing my life. This isn't working.
right. And presumably a male feminist would be uh, dating female feminists, I assume, because from what I've seen, women who are more conservative politically have no use for male feminists.
Hmm.
These women seem to find male feminists repulsive, and so presumably, I'm speaking in generalities here, but presumably, male feminists would be dating female feminists, and in my estimation, female feminists or in anybody of the postmodernist critical studies ideology, anybody who really buys into it, is not as well prepared for relationships as they might otherwise be. And the reason I say that is because if you buy into the critical theory feminism, the real ideological feminism, not equality, not feminism that says we're all equal, not that, but the actual ideological feminism, then what you're practicing over and over and over again, and this has been broken down really nicely by people like Jonathan Haidt, that you're practicing a victim mindset and you're practicing skills that don't translate well to a relationship. So if you're dating someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool ideological feminist, if you're a man dating this woman, and this woman has been conditioned to believe that men are her constant oppressors, that she has really gotten the short end of the stick. Never mind the guy across the street that's building the building and the guy who takes out her trash and the guy who maintains her sewer and the guy who keeps her electricity on. Never mind those guys. She's been taught that she has been grossly mistreated by the patriarchy. Well, if you're the closest man, guess what's going to happen? She's going to see you as her oppressor. And if you also are primed to believe that you're her oppressor, this is a horrible footing for a relationship because you've got somebody who's way up here being the righteous victim and this other person who's way down here who is the nasty oppressor. And ironically, the victim is oppressing the oppressor. And I'm not, so that's one reason is that men should really probably avoid dating doctrinaire feminists, that you are going to be seen as the oppressor at some point. But another reason is just the fact that this kind of ideology, and there are ideologies like this for men too, but this kind of ideology where I'm rehearsing the notion that I'm a victim. Well, what am I not doing while I'm rehearsing that? What I'm not doing is learning how to give and take with other human beings. What I'm not doing is learning how to have a healthy, mutually respectful relationship where we're on equal footing. I'm not practicing any of that. I'm just practicing my victim narrative.
That's fascinating. I'm in the Bay Area, and the Bay Area is sort of ground zero for a lot of this stuff. And I've talked to a number of women personally who completely believe that marriage in particular was a repressive institution where the women were the property of the men, and marriage was an instrument of patriarchal control, and they want to get married, which is very boggling to me.
How do you suppose they reconcile that? That's
That's
a
my
tough one.
question to you, because it's like I've encountered many women who can say pretty much that perspective verbatim on the institution of marriage, but I have yet to meet one who says, I refuse to get married on ideological grounds. Have you?
That just fascinates me.
Like the woman I'm thinking of who said almost those exact language, I was at her wedding like 4 years ago. I wonder if her husband
So
knows that
she's
perspective.
dying to enter this patriarchal, oppressive institution.
It doesn't make sense to me.
No. Well, I guess one possibility is that maybe she doesn't really believe it's that patriarchal and oppressive. Because if she actually thought she was entering into bondage, I don't know, would she do it? Seems unlikely.
Seems unlikely to me too. Let's take another tack, which is, are you familiar with the old Greek play Lysistrata?
No, man, I went to public school. Tell me about Lysistrata.
Lysistrata, I think it was written by Aristophanes. He wrote some comedies back in the day, and this is a very readable play, for ancient Greek theater. And in summary, the plot is that there's a bunch of guys who are just interested in going to war. They're out all day, they're practicing their military exercises, they're always going out on campaigns, they just thinking about the next thing that they can conquer. And the women are pissed off because they're just sort of left at home with the kids. They miss their husbands. They don't want to be in a state of perpetual conflict.
Can I ask a
So they
question?
just, what's that?
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Are they angry because they want to go to war? Or are they angry because their men are gone and they want their men home?
They want the men at home.
Okay.
I think it's from a perspective of I miss my husband. My
Okay.
husband should be spending time with me and the family at home instead of running around with his guy friends and trying to kill and conquer. That's the perspective. Okay. And so the women get together and they sort of devise a plan. And the plan is that, and they had to swear a blood oath, because if anyone broke it, the entire strategy would fall apart. And the strategy was no woman would have sex with her husband until the husbands decided to stop the current war. And that happens in act one. And the next three acts are at first the men sort of laugh it off. Yeah, that woman will be running back to me and my little man in a week or two. And that doesn't happen. And then, the men start to wheedle down certain women to try to create some divisiveness in the group. And that doesn't work either. And then the men get angry, and then the men start to plead, and then the men eventually agree. And there's a victory. And the men decide, yes, this war was stupid. Women are right. We're going to come home, and the women all fuck their husbands. So it's a really interesting story. And I've experienced something akin to Lysistrata while dating in the Bay Area. I have certainly met and dated women who very explicitly withheld sex or refused to date me because I didn't agree completely with their ideological perspectives. Have you encountered that, Shawn?
Well, I'm an old married guy, but I've certainly heard it. Yeah. And it's easy for me to say from where I sit because I have a good relationship, a great marriage with a wonderful woman. But, my armchair assessment is good. Make room for somebody who actually appreciates you. She doesn't want to,
sure.
she doesn't see the value, but
no real love lost there. I'm thinking in particular of one woman who worked as a librarian. She worked in the library system, and I have thousands of books. I'm an avid reader, but she came over to my house and she saw that most of my authors were male. And she said she couldn't date me anymore because I didn't read more female authors than male authors. My rebuttal is I generally read more female authors than people read authors because I read so much, but it didn't make sense to me to choose books that I was going to spend time reading simply because of the gender of the author. I was going to read things that were interesting to me because, it's my time and I should be able to follow my own interests. And I
Not
think,
according to her.
not according to her, but I think she felt very justified in doing that, because I think there is a strain of feminist thought that says that kind of has that Lysistrata approach, which is we can't reinforce men's disagreement with these ideologies. And the easiest way to not reinforce that is to not have sex with them, to not date them, to not give them opportunities for dating and mating.
Yeah. The flaw in their reasoning is that they're not in a small society like in the play. They're in a big society where a lot of women vote for conservatives. So they're competing with the women who actually appreciate men who have, who aren't apologetic about their masculinity.
Yeah.
Now, in the Bay Area, maybe not so much. They may not be competing. There may not be a lot of competition ideologically.
Yeah, I would say that most people, men and women here, are very left-leaning. And it can be shocking for people to encounter somebody who doesn't automatically parrot their beliefs. There's just sort of an assumptive framework that whoever you're talking to is on the far left and will just sort of nod in agreement to whatever talking point you bring up in conversation. This is what I want your perspective on, because you just mentioned that you have a loving wife and you're an old married guy and you seem very satisfied and happy with your relationship. And I experience a lot of men, especially young men, who are very disillusioned about women and the prospect of a long-term partner. And you often hear the phrase, the juice isn't worth the squeeze when it comes to women. So I was wondering if you could help guys understand what good they could potentially get out of a loving marriage or long-term partnership, and how it might be worth the risks associated with that endeavor.
Yeah, it's a question I don't know if I'm very good at answering. I can talk about what I have found useful about it is that I have always been just kind of a relationship guy. I enjoy being in a relationship and wanted to have a small family. And so married a woman who also wanted a small family. And we didn't know exactly where we were going when we got married, but we had a good sense of where we were going. And so it's worked out really well. And most of the guys who say it works well will tell you that they got lucky and they found a good woman. And my response to that is no. It's sometimes it is a question of luck. Guys are generally not trained to choose how to choose relationships. I've asked hundreds of guys, who taught you how to choose relationships? Who taught you how to vet women? And the answer is invariably nobody. We got to figure it out on our own. And so for a lot of guys, it is luck that they just happen to be attracted to somebody who turned out to be a very good person. But I don't think we need to leave it up to luck. I think that if you know where you're going and you know what you want, then we can develop skills as men for vetting relationships, and we can actually have standards. And this is a new concept to a lot of guys, that you can actually have standards in the women that you choose and the relationships that you tolerate. And that's something that just some guys have never really thought about. So I think I'm getting kind of far afield from your question. What is good about relationships? It just depends on what you want. I'm a clinician, which means I tend to think about individuals versus researchers and sociologists who think about groups. They think about forests and I think about trees. And so when you say, what's good about a relationship? Well, what does this particular tree want? Maybe this particular tree doesn't want a relationship. Maybe this tree just wants a different kind of life. But if you want a relationship, you better get skilled at choosing that relationship, because even though you can divorce and you can break up, sometimes the consequences follow you for a lifetime. It's not something you can easily step away from once you develop the entanglements.
Okay, I hear that. How would I respond? I'm interested in the idea of standards for men, because I can imagine a pushback to that would be, oh yeah, that sounds great, Shawn. I'll have the high standards on the two women who I have access
Yeah.
to, and when I apply them, I'm going to have zero women. So I
Yeah.
just don't have the luxury of standards. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I've thought about that question for years now, because that is a real question, that you're surrounded by a handful of prospects, and either they're of low character or they're of high character, but the values don't match, or for whatever reason, the relationship doesn't work. And so, the answer is sometimes it really sucks that if you're going to actually have standards, that you're factoring out a lot of good people. But what's your alternative? If the alternative is, well, I'm going to lower my standards and I'm going to roll the dice and marry this person or connect with this person, develop some entanglements like children and mortgage and all these things with this person who is of low character. If that's your alternative, that's not a great alternative to having standards. And so the answer is not a very satisfying one, but I think the answer is that the more capable you are in the world, and the more resourceful and the more accomplished and the more prestige you have, the more options you're going to have. And that's not a very satisfying answer, because there are a lot of guys out there who are not doing particularly well. And it's not necessarily because they haven't been trying. Maybe they've been trying their asses off
Or
and
they're
they're
actually
just
doing
not
pretty
succeeding.
well, but they're in a position that isn't very prestigious. Like maybe
Yeah.
they have a small plumbing company or something like that, and they make decent money and they're well established. They have good values, but that's certainly not a very prestigious job.
No. Well, it is to me, because, and probably to you, because we're men and we value these things, but it's not necessarily what people think of when they think of prestige. They think of bank president and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not knocking plumbers, but I'm saying that most women aren't sending them
yeah.
DMs when they
Yeah.
find out that they're plumbers.
Yeah. They're sending a phone call when their pipes are blocked, but um, so to speak. But yeah, and that's where um, I think when you're thinking of prestige and accomplishment in life, that plumber who's doing well professionally, he may not be presenting well in his personal life.
Mm.
Maybe he doesn't know how to dress well. Maybe he doesn't know how to carry himself well. And these are skills that are easily developed, much more easily than learning how to plumb pipes. Learning how to dress yourself, learning how to conduct yourself. Yeah, these things can be mastered.
Agreed. So I get what you're saying about the standards and optionality. Here's something that I've seen as a clinician and among my personal friends, and it's somewhat surprising, is that I've seen guys get married to women that I thought were not great matches for them because they evinced something akin to like a biological clock. And it usually happens around round numbers. They're like, I'm 30, I need to settle down, or I'm 40. If I don't find somebody soon, it's going to be too late for me, which to my mind always seemed like such a feminine perspective. But I see it fairly often with guys. Like they seem to feel like they have to operate under the same time pressure as women. Have you noticed this?
I haven't seen so much of it, but I hear what you're saying, and I believe that you're seeing it.
Okay.
Yeah, and now that I think, yeah, I have seen it out there, and I agree with you. It's not a relation. It's not a perspective that men need to take as much as women. It's very real for women because they have a different timeline, as you've mentioned. Ours is a little more delayed. But it sounds like you're talking about guys who get a little bit panicked, and so they enter relationships because they're anxious about not having a relationship.
Yeah, I'm bringing it up because it seems like it's just another form of scarcity. So there's a form of scarcity like I don't have a lot of options, so I can't exercise adequate standards. But another form is I don't have enough time, so I can't really afford to exercise adequate standards. I don't want to be the old dad who's at the PTA meetings falling asleep because he didn't have a nap. So I need to find somebody now.
Yeah. The old guy that didn't have the nap. Yeah. I've been guilty of that once or twice. But yeah, and I think part of the answer to that is getting your sense of value squared away as early as you can as a man. And it's tough as a man because you gotta figure out what you're gonna do with your life. We wake up one day as young men, and suddenly the world is expecting something of us, and we hadn't really bargained for that. Some of us were trained that we're going to need to produce, but some of us just wake up one day and suddenly we're in the position and we haven't really figured out where we're going. And the sooner you figure it out, the less the chance that you're going to be 30 or 40 or 50 and have this sense of dread that, oh, I'm kind of missing out on something here that I wanted.
I see this a lot. Like about a quarter of my private practice clients, I would call like failure to launch cases. And they're generally guys in their 20s who don't have a relationship, don't really have career prospects. They're still living with their parents. They often don't see the point. They believe that they're already so far behind that it's like there's no point in even trying to catch up. They have
Yeah.
very pessimistic and hopeless view of the future. I'm sure you're seeing this more. Why do you think that is? What's causing this? Because I don't think this has ever been the case in human history.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if it's been the case. It certainly has been the case at some point in some place, but I hear what you're saying. This is kind of a unique thing, at least in our society, American society. This is new, where we have guys who are really struggling this way. And that's where I'm very conscious of the fact when I talk to guys about having standards, that when that guy hears me say have standards, it probably just evokes rage, because he probably hears me saying, well, just go out and buy a Lamborghini. Well, how? I got nothing going on. Like that's a horrible thing for him to hear. But I think guys, there is tremendous opportunity in this society for guys who really want to buckle down, because, and this, let me think about how I want to say this, because the expectations are so low for men. It's almost like there's endless opportunities for a guy who is very smart and strategic about how he's going to allocate his resources. And so maybe going and getting a degree in sociology isn't the thing for a guy to do these days, but maybe starting a plumbing company is. And if he can build other skills, social skills on top of that, there's no end of opportunity out there. And I'm not sure what's causing this hopelessness and this nihilism among so many young men.
Yeah. Because while the world is still competitive, if so many men are struggling, we could also make the argument that it has never been easier in the history of mankind to be an extraordinary man.
Yeah. I think that's a much more eloquent way of what I was stumbling around trying to say a minute ago.
Mm.
But the guy who's depressed, and really that's a lot of times what we're talking about, is a guy ends up feeling depressed. And depressed is a non-specific symptom, right? It's like having a fever. We don't know what depression means, but if a guy is depressed as a result of the sense that there's no way for him to succeed, getting out of depression is tough, because what it takes is action, and depression steals your incentive, your energy to go out and act. And so pulling yourself out of, I'm talking to a clinician, I know, but for anyone who doesn't, there's this, it's tempting to say to somebody who's depressed, well, you just need to get out there. And you just need to, you need to get up and put your shoes on and just get out there tomorrow. And that's easy to say, but when you're in a depressed state, it's the hardest thing in the world to do.
And there's some truth to it. I mean, there's the
Absolutely. Yeah.
there's the perspective that if you simply relent to the behavioral impulse suggested by depression, which is inaction, that the depression just gets bigger and you're feeding it.
Mm-hmm.
And Marshall Linehan talks about this in terms of opposite action, is that if you want an emotion to diminish, you have to be willing to execute the behavior that's diametrically opposed to the suggestion of the emotion. So if depression is telling you to do nothing, to be inactive, to withdraw, to isolate, on some level, even though it's very, very hard and extremely uncomfortable and it feels very alien to you in that moment, you kind of have to force yourself to do the opposite of all those things, and to be willing to abide in a state where it feels inauthentic, it feels strange, it feels alienating, long enough for like the dissonance to resolve on the side of your action. Because that's why opposite action works. I know you understand this, but like if you're doing something at odds with how you're feeling, your mind is like, this doesn't make sense. There's dissonance there. And ultimately, it tends to give precedence to collapsing on the side of action, because that's more of a reliable predictor of how you should be feeling, is what you're doing. And we see that when we judge other people. It's like, don't really focus on how they feel, don't really focus so much on what they say, but watch what they do. That's a more reliable predictor of how they really feel and what's really going on.
Absolutely. That's all very well said. And Marshall Linehan and dialectical behavior therapy, it's brilliant stuff. I think everybody should read it because it's got skills for everybody. So yeah, well said.
Well, speaking of things that I think everybody should read, I think that every man should read The Tactical Guide to Women, which you pitched yourself, but I'm going to pitch here. I'm not even getting like an affiliate cut here. I just think that this is a fantastic book. I read it twice. I've bought copies for other people. I can't hold it up right now because my copy's actually loaned out to somebody else right now, but I think it's a fantastic book. And I think it's really, really helpful. And it provides a clear and systematic framework for guys to rationally examine their women in their lives. And the market did not have an entry that did quite that. And I think your book does it very well. So thank you so much for writing that book.
Appreciate that.
I hope that other people will check it out, because it definitely deserves to be read and read widely.
Well, thanks, Orion. I really appreciate that.
You got any last words for us today?
No, I'm always bad with the last words part. I should prepare a list of closing thoughts, I think.
Is there anything else you want to pitch? You want us to know about? Do you have a channel? If someone wants to get in touch with you, how can they do that? Anything like that?
I have a website called ironshrink.com. It's a blog that I occasionally post at, pretty rarely, but I'm also on Twitter at ironshrink. And that's about it. Got another book coming out in September, which will be a follow-up to The Tactical Guide to Women, a little different angle on the same question of how do you vet women in relationships.
Very exciting. I can't wait for that to hit. Well, thank you so much.
We're pretending like you haven't read it. You actually read it.
I did read it. You were kind
enough. You were kind enough to read an early draft so that I can make some necessary changes. You gave me some unbelievably useful feedback. So when the book comes out, however good it is 10% gooder because of what you had to offer there.
Oh, that's very sweet. And as I said, it was an honor to read your advanced copy. It's going to be a great book. It's going to help a lot of people. So thank you so much for participating in this first experiment. We'll see how it goes. And we'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Ryan.
Bye-bye.